Here in the 21st, do you hear from a number of voters who you're meeting for the first time who immediately want to know your position on the Second Amendment and on guns?
You know, I was expecting that. I honestly was. And I know it has been a really lively issue in prior election cycles. This time it does come up periodically. It's not as prominent as I thought it might be.
After the school shooting in the Atlanta suburb a couple of weeks ago, Joe Biden immediately called for reinstating the ban on assault rifles and high-capacity magazines. Do you think there is any appetite in Congress to take steps like that, new, stronger gun laws?
You know, Congress is and that's why I want to go to Congress, is we're at a place where we can't seem to decide anything. We can't seem to get very much legislation passed. More so than the words of Joe Biden, I've been encouraged by how Tim Walz is able to walk this line very carefully and say, yeah, he's a hunter. Yes, he has guns, but he doesn't think that his Second Amendment rights should be prioritized over the health and safety of children in schools.
Would you support a ban on assault rifles and high-capacity magazines?
I would align with that language that Tim Walz carved out. So it's all about health and safety, and it's in particular about health and safety of children.
Some of the issues, again, what about the economy? For so many voters, the economy is the big issue this election. How do you bring down inflation?
Well, who caused the inflation? And I'm not even talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about we're going to the pump or we're going to the grocery store and we're seeing the prices edge. And it's interesting because as I drive around NY-21, which I'm putting a lot of miles on the car, the price will range from $3.21 a gallon in some places all the way up to $3.84. That's a huge gap. That's enormous. Thank goodness I'm not trying to make my living as a trucker, right?
Yeah.
But have we heard that the oil companies are in any kind of financial trouble? No. So I would attribute our inflation really to corporate profits. Same thing with the grocery stores. And we're looking at, you know, this merger of Kroger and Albertsons, and that's not the only one. I mean, there are other similar mergers and acquisitions that will affect our supply chain that will eventually mean that the marketplace is less competitive and that the prices will be passed on to the consumer. Then let's look at tariffs. Donald Trump has talked about we're going to bring all of these tariffs onto goods from China. Well, China's not going to pay that. China doesn't pay the tariffs. It gets passed along to the consumer. So those plastics, those electronics, those inexpensive clothes that we all love to get because they're less expensive will not be as inexpensive anymore. So I am unconvinced that the rising prices that we have experienced are the result of government, and more convinced, just as somebody who has studied a little bit about tax and about economy and contracts as well, and really want to put it at the feet of the corporations, which, by the way, one of the big parts of Trump's platform is let's give the corporations an even bigger tax cut.
What about border security? There's been a historic jump in the number of migrants crossing the northern border from Canada into New York. How do you address that?
Of course. Now, there was a historic jump, and then it's leveled off. And let's talk about that bipartisan immigration bill that was that had full support. We could see it going through, and at the last minute, Donald Trump signaled to his supporters that he wanted this issue kept alive during the election cycle. So who is that helping? I think that's helping Donald Trump and other MAGA Republicans rather than helping the people who live in Champlain or other border place, you know, where they're really seeing migrants come over. Now, I have had voters come up to me, they'll see the signs on my car and they'll say, there are migrants in the street. And this, you know, the last time this happened, I was in Long Lake. And I turned and I said, I don't see them. I just don't see the migrants in the streets. Do we know that there are migrants? Yes, there are. But What we really need is sweeping immigration reform, and we had it in the form of more border agents to actually stop at the border, more border judges to process applications, and also other what is really needed, honestly, to support our small businesses and our robust travel industry, the hospitality industry that thrives in our area, would be a temporary work visa, so that people who came over would be able to immediately support, or within I think that what was contemplated was in a 6-month period of time, would be able to get work and could then support themselves and contribute meaningfully. Statistically speaking, the migrants are not the ones causing crime to spike. They're not the ones causing, statistically speaking, once somebody has been established in the country long enough to be a homeowner, there's a much lower default rate from those people who immigrate to our country. So and let's look at our healthcare industry. We desperately need healthcare workers. If we create an onerous border policy, we better be prepared to wait longer at clinics and perhaps not even have clinics, because frankly, a lot of our doctors and nurses and aides are immigrants. And so we need a workable border policy. We definitely need that. We need more border security, and we had the ability in terms of border agents, and the Donald Trump signal, no, we're not ready for that. So let's look at who killed that bill. It wasn't the Democrats.
You created a stir and got some national headlines back in early June when you made a comment to send supporters of former President Donald Trump to re-education camps as part of an effort to fix what you called the MAGA nightmare. Was that an off-color comment? Was it a joke? Was it at a virtual town event, town meeting?
Yeah, so the situation was a virtual town hall. We had actually completed the town hall. It was very small, very thin attendance, and now I know that on Zoom it's possible, you see the Hollywood Squares on Zoom, but there can also be other viewers or listeners who don't even have a phone number in the squares. So there, and I only know this by looking back at the metadata. So there was somebody in there who was present for the call, and we weren't even aware that they were there. But they took a remark that was made really after the town hall. It was retracted in the same breath in which I made the remark, and then it was edited and played on Fox News, completely out of context. And it was so interesting because as I was dealing with the aftermath, which involved a personal safety issue, because my personal safety was threatened, my daughter's personal safety was threatened, it got very scary very quickly. And I don't know that that came from the Stefanik campaign. I think it just came from MAGA supporters in general. But we were very frightened. But even in that fear, the very next day we were hearing George Conway saying very similar language, not that he had heard it from me, but it was a call for civics re-education, or a call for civics, a return to the basics of how does our government work. And that's what I was calling for. It was an off-color remark, and as I say, it was retracted in the very moment in which it was said. I said this thing, and then I said, but we can't really say that. We can't really call it that. And everyone that was present and accounted for in the Hollywood Squares laughed and said, yeah, we can. So do I regret the moment? Yes, I do. Do I regret the sentiment? No, I don't, because we do need to review what's the balance of powers about? Why is it that some of us are concerned that maybe the Supreme Court is taking a little more power than they should, or maybe this whole immunities thing, that's going to give the executive office more power than it should. So I think the sentiment is very much there, and it's not an original idea.
You are planning and have held some campaign events with some former members of Donald Trump's administration, including his lawyer, Michael Cohen, and Lev Parnas, who was an associate of former mayor and Trump advisor Rudy Giuliani. And also Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, who was a senior advisor to Melania Trump, the First Lady, and wrote a tell-all book that many people are familiar with. Why are you teaming up with these folks, and what are you hoping that they're going to do for you and your campaign?
Well, it's a little bit related to that civics education piece, in that what, Lev is now my personal friend. I was introduced to Lev from another friend and through a professional connection as well. And Lev talked about, and he talks about it in his book, about being so enamored of Donald Trump and so into the MAGA world that he was willing to do anything. And, I talked about this was a time for me to drop everything and jump into this particular election cycle. Lev was willing and and actually did drop everything in his life and get involved in Trump world, and was fully dedicated to doing what Rudy Giuliani was asking him to do, which was at the behest of Donald Trump. So there was a flow amongst the three. And at one point, and Lev describes it very carefully in his book, he realized these people aren't working for the voters. Donald Trump is not working to represent voters. Donald Trump is working to represent Donald Trump. And so each of the individuals whom you named, Lev Parnas, Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, there's also Anthony Scaramucci and Michael Cohen, each of them is passionate about, first of all, defeating MAGA, not Republicans, but MAGA, that rhetoric that we've gotten into. And each of them is passionate that a vote for Elise Stefanik is a proxy vote for Donald Trump. A vote for Elise Stefanik is very destructive to the integrity of our electoral process and of our government process, and that she's disruptive, and it is time for us to turn the page and have a new kind of voice in Congress.